Okay, welcome. I'm Philip Bowman, Director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity, and I welcome you to this forum on diversity issues in higher education, recent research findings, and global implications. We are really in for a treat. We have an opportunity to hear, on the one hand, from one of the rising scholars in the area of diversity in higher education and some recent findings from some work that's inspired by one of our panelists who will make some commentary afterwards. And our panelists who make some commentary afterwards was really engaged in some very landmark work on diversity issues in higher education that most of you know was very instrumental in the University of Michigan Supreme Court case in 2003. And in many ways, this discourse and exchange today will kind of build on the critical issues involved in that evidence and look at some more recent findings and to, in addition to other implications, kind of put the discussion not only in the context of questions about organizational implications or student development implications, but also the kind of global implications of the kind of critical issues in higher education that both the presenter as well as one of the panelists will share. The second panelist that we'll have today is not engaged in diversity work per se, but is an expert in student development work and will kind of also chime in from the vantage point of an expert in higher education to kind of look at and make some commentary on the implications of some of the issues discussed. What we'll basically do is also, I'd like to mention that this particular session is co-sponsored between the National Center for Institutional Diversity and the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education. Also, it may be worth mentioning that this event is part of the Martin Luther King Symposium series. That's, as you know, quite a ritual here at University of Michigan during the month of January. And in some ways, we like to locate this talk also in the context of ongoing distinguished lecture series that National Center for Institutional Diversity has sponsored over the years. We'll have this one and a couple of others this semester that focuses more on some of the younger scholars who've done exemplary work in the area of diversity and are certainly headed toward distinguished careers. I'd like to the format today is I'd like to introduce the speaker initially, and then give a fuller introduction to the two panelists after she's done. But Uma Jayakumar is a postdoctoral fellow here at the University of Michigan in the National Center for Institutional Diversity, and we're very, very happy that we were able to attract her here from UCLA. She's done work there where she received her doctoral degree under the mentorship of Walter Allen, who many of you might know. Walter was a long time professor here in the Department of Sociology and has since that time done a nationally distinguished work in the area of higher education. And Uma comes here not only after having completed a dissertation that won the Dissertation of the Year award at the ASH conference, or the ASH organization, which is the leading organization for higher education research in the country, but also having worked as a postdoctoral scholar there in leadership roles with both Walter Allen and Sylvia Hurtado. And we were very, very happy to be able to attract her here to work with us at the National Center for this year. And her work that she'll talk about today is based on a recent publication in the Harvard Education Review, which I think we've tried to send to people who've been interested in this forum. And if you haven't received it, we'll have it available on our webpage. But this particular publication titled, "Can Higher Education Meet the Needs of an Increasingly Diverse and Global Society?" And there's a question, and it's a subtitle, "Campus Diversity and Cross-Cultural Workforce Competencies," was published in 2008. in the Harvard Education Review. And as I suggested earlier, it was inspired by the earlier 202 publication by Patricia Gurin, Eric Dye, Sylvia Hurtado, and Gerald Gurin on diversity issues in higher education, which again was the foundations for Patricia's testimony in the Supreme Court. And this presentation will be followed by remarks from both Patricia and Pat King. I might also note that Eric Dye was supposed to be a third panelist, but he will not be able to join us today. But we have several colleagues, I noticed, in the audience from the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education, including Deborah Carter, Ed St. John, and Larry Rowley, who we would definitely call upon in Eric's behalf to make some commentary and ask some questions in the discussion and question and answer period that follows Patricia and Pat King's comments. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Uma.
Thank you for that warm introduction. And thank you all for coming. I'm very happy to be here and excited to share some of my research and specifically a recent article that I published on the topic of racial diversity in higher education. The article came out about a month ago in the Harvard Ed Review, and it builds on the seminal work, as Dr. Bowman suggested, of Pat Gurin, Eric Dye, Sylvia Hurtado, Jerry Gurin, and others who have contributed to a rich body of literature on the educational benefits of diversity. Their research, and Pat Gurin's research in particular, her expert testimony, played a very important role in shaping the outcomes for the affirmative action cases here at the University of Michigan. I was very inspired by the critical role that social justice research and social science research in particular played in shaping the outcomes of the Supreme Court decisions. And I was very frustrated by some of the comments made by the dissenting court justices as well. And so what better way to spend your dissertation than on something that really frustrates you? And I felt compelled to address some of these doubts and to do so in a way that interjected a social justice imperative. And I think that in this court case, in comparison to the Bakke case, the people were very wise in starting to interject that kind of language, moving it from diversity to integration, and they were very purposeful in doing that. And I also felt like I could further do that by incorporating a discussion of racial climate on college campuses. So before I give you a formal outline of my presentation, I'd like to talk to you about what I see as the point of my presentation today. So how many of you have heard the following criticisms? And you could just raise your hands. Affirmative action is reverse discrimination. The only ones who benefit are people of color. Yeah, that's one of my favorites. And the other one, another popular one is that increasing diversity on college campuses leads to racial balkanization. So if students are going to choose to self-segregate, students of color in particular, if they're going to choose to self-segregate, what's the point of increasing student body diversity? How many of you have heard that? Yeah. And then thirdly, the diversity rationale, which was first introduced in the Bakke case, is just code for pushing for racial aesthetics on college campuses. And this is something that one of the court justices had said in the dissenting opinions. And this is a very interesting one because it's actually a comment that is a manifestation of what many progressive scholars had warned would happen if we divorced the diversity rationale from incorporating a social justice agenda. And one of those people who was very outspoken about that is Walter Allen. So I believe that it's both and. We need the Band-Aid solutions, and we also need larger discussions of social justice. But for now, the way I see my work is a way to try to start to incorporate that type of language into the diversity rationale as well. So I'll begin my talk by highlighting the growing diversity of the U.S. population and the problems that have arisen within this social context. and then I'll show you how I address these problems through the mechanics of my study, followed by the conclusions and implications of my analysis. And finally, we'll get to hear from the distinguished panelists before opening it up for questions from everybody. And please feel free to ask questions throughout. So current media headlines provide a context for the relevance of cross-cultural workforce competencies today.
In the 1950s, 87% of our population was of European descent. Now that proportion is dropping precipitously. How soon until white people are the minority?
I hereby declare on oath.
It's a different America than the 1967 version. Now, just over half the population is white, when it was over 3/4 white then.
The face of America is changing because the faces of America are changing. Right now, out of a total population of 300 million, 1 in 3, that's 100 million people, belongs to a minority group. Just over 44 million Hispanics are the country's biggest minority. Blacks rank second at just over 40 million, followed by nearly 15 million people of Asian descent.
Okay, so in line with these news clips, the Department of Labor states that by the year 2050, people of color will be in the U.S. majority. Meanwhile, in neighborhoods and schools, we're seeing a trend toward greater levels of segregation. And here you see a map of the mainland illustrating the high level of segregation in the U.S. today, where yellow represents the concentration of whites. And just as a more specific example of a very urban and diverse area, this is Los Angeles, and when we look at it, although there's a lot of diversity, people of color are concentrated within their own pockets of areas. Jonathan Kozol writes about this phenomenon of resegregation in his book, The Shame of the Nation.
I mean, these are schools. When I say deeply segregated, I don't just mean, kind of segregated. These are schools straight across America in which you simply never see white children. And I'm talking about schools in cities as diverse as New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle, and many small cities in between. In all, I spent 5 years visiting 60 schools in order to write this book. If you were with me in one of these classrooms and you had a camera and you took a photo of the children in the class, it would be indistinguishable from those old photos in our textbooks of all black classrooms in Mississippi 50 years ago.
So other scholars have come to the same conclusions.
Dr. Gary Orfield studies resegregation and finds that American schools are backsliding at a disturbing pace, increasingly segregated by class, language, and race. According to a 2007 Civil Rights Project report, in 1968, 23% of black students in America were attending majority white schools. By 1988, that number had climbed to 37%. And by 2005, the number was falling, back down to 27%. Several Supreme Court decisions as recent as this past summer have limited desegregation efforts. That, Orfield says, is to every child's detriment.
Children tend to learn more in integrated schools.
So as Gary Orfield points out, most students have only minimally interacted with people of different racial backgrounds by the time they graduate from high school. So these students are likely to be ill-prepared to be able to thrive in a diverse and global marketplace. So the fact of the matter is that for most of these students, college becomes their last opportunity to develop these cross-cultural workforce skills before they enter the workforce. So the big question becomes, are colleges and universities preparing students who primarily come from segregated environments to be able to adapt to different cultural perspectives and environments? This is a question that has received great national attention. Just 3 years ago, U.S. Secretary of Education Margaret Spelling issued a report assessing the current and future of higher education in the U.S. In it, she acknowledges that the U.S. higher education system has been acknowledged and celebrated as one of the best in the world. But her assessment now, or at that moment 3 years ago, is that the continued ability of American post-secondary institutions to produce informed and skilled citizens who are able to lead and compete in the 21st century global marketplace may soon be in question. And the business community has been asking this question for over a decade now. They've issued several reports, all with the common sentiment of dissatisfaction with higher education. In one report, corporate respondents asserted that colleges are failing to develop students who can work effectively with individuals whose norms, preferences, belief styles, and values are quite different from their own. Similarly, the Business Higher Education Forum reports dissatisfaction with graduates' cross-functional skills. The business community views racial diversity on college campuses as integral to the country's economic well-being. And for this reason, when the court cases were filed against the University of Michigan for their affirmative action practices, a number of the top U.S. corporations submitted amicus briefs in support of the university. For example, the General Motors stated that diversity in academic institutions augments the skills, cross-cultural competence, and complex thinking that students need to help lead our country's economic future. The notion that diversity is central to the role of higher education in preparing students for a diverse workplace is supported by a strong base of research. And diversity is associated with a host of educational outcomes. For example, the ability to take someone else's perspective, civic values, democratic sensibilities, and this research has played a very important role in supporting affirmative action. Most of these studies, however, look at diversity over a 4-year period, and Pat Guerin's study that was submitted to the Supreme Court in her expert testimony was the first to look at the long-term benefits of diversity that are associated with cross-racial interaction in college. The research literature also offers a rationale for why and how diversity works. Guerin and her colleagues developed this theoretical rationale based on psychosocial theories of cognitive and moral development. And I broke it down into 2 parts. Their theory explains that the traditional college age years come at a critical juncture in the life cycle where students are developing their worldviews. So at first, when they arrive, they start to move away from their automatic thinking and accepting the words of authority to start to think for themselves. And Erickson calls this stage psychosocial moratorium. And at this stage, they start to develop and be exposed to new ideas. And then in the end of that experience, they solidify their worldviews and beliefs. So developmental theorists have also explained that people generally operate in a mode of automatic thinking, governed by previous learning schemas, stereotypes, and scripts. So for example, when we're driving, we're kind of in autopilot mode where we're not really actively thinking. So Guerin and her colleagues theorized that when students from segregated neighborhoods are exposed to racial diversity in college, they experience dissonance, instability, and disequilibrium that interrupts their automatic thinking, and as a result promotes cognitive growth. So Guerin presented this rationale in her expert testimony in the court. Both the empirical and theoretical rationale, coupled with the concerns of the business community, national leaders, and the military, led the Supreme Court to uphold the consideration of race. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who delivered the majority opinion, emphasized that the skills needed in today's increasingly global marketplace can only be developed through exposure to widely diverse people, cultures, ideas, and viewpoints. However, the national debate over race-conscious policies, such as affirmative action and desegregation efforts, has continued, and in the past 6 years alone, the Supreme Court has taken up 4 landmark cases pertaining to race-conscious policies. The first 2, which we've mentioned, both Dr. Bowman and I, involved the University of Michigan for their affirmative action policies. And the last 2 dealt with school assignment plans that considered the distribution of students across school districts and in maintaining balanced schools. So given the continued debate over race-conscious practices, it's important to empirically document and better understand the impact of cross-racial interaction on student developmental outcomes and the context under which diversity leads to benefits for students. So just to briefly go over the gaps in the literature, there's limited empirical evidence of the long-term benefits of diversity on post-college outcomes. And like I said, Pat Guerin's work was the first to look at the associations between cross-racial interaction in college and other types of diversity on these long-term outcomes. And also there's an unresolved debate about the value of structural diversity. I mentioned earlier the balkanization argument, which is one of them, and then the other, which was also cited in the Supreme Court case, is a study by Wood and Sherman, who argue that because structural diversity drops out of the regression equation when cross-racial interaction enters, that there really isn't a need for structural diversity, that the positive benefits that accrue from or that are generally associated with diversity can actually be achieved through other means. And then thirdly, the lack of empirical research that connects structural diversity, campus racial climate, and the benefits. I think that's really important, again, in terms of looking at how students of color are impacted on college campuses with regard to discrimination, and how it's important to address that if we're going to actually make the benefits of diversity for all students. So just to remind you, if I lost anybody, of my research questions, or actually, I think this is the first time okay, so this is the first time, but I'm going to remind you later. My research questions are, does structural diversity lead to cross-racial interaction in college? Second, how does cross-racial interaction impact whites' pluralistic orientation in the post-college years? And third, does cross-racial interaction have a different impact on whites from segregated pre-college neighborhoods versus those from diverse pre-college neighborhoods? Data for the study were provided by the Higher Education Research Institute, and they specifically came from 3 studies that were administered across a 10-year period. Excuse me. HARI is home to the Cooperative Institutional Research Program, which is the largest standing and longest study of college students and the impact of college. And the survey collects data on demographics, high school experiences, student dispositions, attitudes, college experiences, and life goals. I conducted my analysis on white students only, and I had several reasons for doing so. My first reason was based on Derek Bell's notion of interest convergence, in which he argues that change towards social justice is facilitated when those in power view the dominant group as benefiting from that change. And also in line with that, the rhetoric around affirmative action is so often focused heavily on the benefits to people of color, and we talk much, or it's less focused on how it also benefits whites. And second, whites are most likely to come from segregated environments from their childhood, and they're least likely to engage in cross-racial interaction during the college years. And third was based on methodological considerations. The sample size was much larger for white students, which decreased the problem of the multi-level nature of the data, and it also allowed me to include more variables in my structural equation model. So in order to test Pat Guerin's theory of diversity's impact, I divided my sample into 2 groups. Those from segregated neighborhoods, defined as most or all of the people in their neighborhood being of the same race, and those from diverse neighborhoods where half to none of the people were of the same race. And both samples were very similar in terms of their educational attainment, their income levels, parental education, and 99.6% of them were between the ages of 17 to 20. And this was really important given that we're looking at the student developmental cycle in that period. And the major difference between the 2 groups was that people who came from segregated environments tended to go to segregated high schools, and those who were in diverse neighborhoods went to diverse high schools. Does anyone have any questions so far? No? Okay. So I employed structural equation modeling for my analytical approach, and this is a small portion of the structural model. It includes the key variables and hypothesized relationships that I'm going to be focusing on in today's presentation. One of the benefits of using SEM is that it makes it possible to look at direct and indirect effects. For example, I'm looking at how structural diversity directly impacts cross-racial interaction, but I'm also interested in how structural diversity indirectly impacts cross-racial interaction through racial climate. So the arrows represent the direct and indirect effects and my hypothesized relationships. And another major advantage of using SEM is the ability to examine abstract phenomenon. How many of you are familiar with SEM? Okay, so for those of you who aren't, what I think is really exciting is in social science research, we often want to look at abstract phenomenon that we're not able to capture, or it's not as easy to capture in other methods. So for example, if you wanted to look at the phenomenon of happiness, it's really hard to measure happiness, but we would be able to measure, for example, if I did an hour-long observation of how long people were smiling over that hour, I could take that as a data note. I could ask you for a self-report of how happy you are, and I could look at your attitude and if it's generally a positive attitude, and then I can make an assessment of your overall happiness. So that's kind of what I was able to do by using SEM, and the ovals represent the latent constructs in my model. And just to give you an example of one of my latent constructs, here we have pluralistic orientation. And pluralistic orientation is an abstract phenomenon that reflects students' change in ways of thinking from a dualistic perspective to multiple perspective-taking skills. And it was measured by the following 4 survey items. Students' assessments of their ability to discuss and negotiate controversial issues, the ability to see the world from someone else's perspective, openness to having their views challenged, and tolerance of others with different beliefs. Okay, and so here are some of my other key variables that I'm discussing today. So I already shared with you the pluralistic orientation. Cross-racial interaction was also a latent construct that was made up of 4 items that capture the frequency of interaction with people of different races. A racially integrated post-college lifestyle was measured in the post-college years, and it is a measure of the diversity of these individuals' adult neighborhoods, their workplace, and their current friends. And the last 2 measures, structural diversity and campus race relations, or what I call campus climate, are aggregate level measures. So everyone within the same institution would have the same score on those measures. So structural diversity is based on institutional data, and it's the percentage of people of color on a college campus. And campus race relations, or campus climate, is an aggregate of all of the students within a campus, and it's based on 35,000 plus students, all of their scores on cross-racial interaction. So because campus climate is so hard to measure, I thought a good way to measure it was by looking at how often people feel comfortable interacting with people on average within a school. So again, now here's the reminder of my research questions. Does structural diversity lead to cross-racial interaction in college? How does cross-racial interaction impact whites' pluralistic orientation in the post-college years? And does cross-racial interaction have a differential impact on whites from segregated versus those who come from diverse neighborhoods? So this is just to give you an idea of my full structural model. And if you get a chance to look at my Harvard Ed Review piece, you'll get a little bit more than you're getting from this presentation. But for now, I'm going to focus, for the first question, on these 3 key variables. And this is an important question because it addresses what critics of affirmative action had suggested about, or their questioning of the value of structural diversity on college campuses. Okay. So The findings related to the structural diversity, racial climate, and cross-racial interaction variables were essentially the same for students in both groups. As you can see, there's no indirect effect from structural diversity to cross-racial interaction. So what that means is just by increasing diversity on college campuses, it's not going to lead people to interact with people of different races, and therefore it's not going to necessarily lead to the educational benefits of diversity. What we do see is a strong indirect effect mediated by racial climate. So when structural diversity does have an impact is when there is a positive racial climate, and that allows for people to engage with others of different races in a productive way. And in the larger model, we find that structural diversity and racial climate have a significant indirect effect on the outcome variables. So this is very strong evidence against the balkanization argument. And it also is evidence against what scholars have suggested about structural diversity not being significant because it drops out of the equation. What I'm able to show here is that there is a positive indirect effect that's mediated by other. Sure.
In an earlier chart, you had things attached to this, and I just wondered if you could remind us. I was thinking that you had the racial climate, structural diversity were indexed from 1994, and that the post-college interactions were 2004. But when was the CRI located? Was that during college or after college?
Okay, that's a good question. So the study is over a 10-year period. It follows students longitudinally from 94 to 98 to 2004. And so generally when people take aggregates, I could have chosen to take the full sample and then looked at the averages within those institutions for the racial climate variable. But because the 98 data had more students within each of those schools, so 35,000 plus students, I wanted to get more students included in that average. So that was the reason I chose to include more students in the sample. Does that answer your question?
It probably answers my question.
Okay.
And I just wondered that cross-racial interaction.
When was that measured?
When was that measured?
Okay. Cross-racial interaction was measured in 98.
Okay.
In
so
98.
When you go up to the chart that one that you're on now, before I interrupted you, with the red circles. Yeah.
Yeah. So the structural diversity and the racial climate, actually, all of these are like we're looking at the college experience right now. But in terms of when they were measured, structural diversity was measured based on IPEDS data in 2000, and then racial climate was based on in 98.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So for the second part, I'll focus on these 5 variables. Let's see. And so those 5 variables help us to look at the second 2 questions about the benefits of diversity on the long-term benefits of diversity. So what is the impact of cross-racial interaction in college? So I'll first start with whites from segregated pre-college neighborhoods. For both groups, cross-racial interaction in college led to increased levels of pluralistic orientation and socializing with people of different races in the post-college years. And this supports the anecdotal stories of the business community about the benefits of campus diversity on individuals' ability to openly and more comfortably engage with people of different races in the workforce as they reach adulthood. And that was the case for whites from racially diverse neighborhoods as well. So as a second point, I want to bring in perpetuation hypothesis, which was found to be true in past research and also mentioned in Pat Guerin's expert testimony. So perpetuation hypothesis was posed by Braddock, and what it is that he says that people who start off in segregated neighborhoods tend to continue to stay in segregated neighborhoods in adulthood. So what this study is also showing is in support of a perpetuation hypothesis, the subsample of whites from diverse pre-college neighborhoods were already most likely to choose an integrated post-college lifestyle. So when I did latent means modeling, which is basically like an ANOVA, I found that the people from racially diverse neighborhoods were more likely to live in integrated post-college environments. However, cross-racial interaction wasn't necessary for them to be able to choose integrated post-college lifestyles. They were already going to choose those environments. And as you could see, if they attended a diverse high school, they were even more likely to choose those environments. But however, when we look at whites from segregated pre-college neighborhoods, it's absolutely critical for them to engage in cross-racial interaction in college if they are to choose an integrated post-college lifestyle. So, So cross-racial interaction in college can break this cycle of segregation that is suggested by the perpetuation hypothesis. Okay. So just to give you an overview of the key findings, first, structural diversity does matter. It doesn't merely lead to self-segregation. The significant indirect impact of pluralistic orientation has long-term effects as well. And cross-racial interaction leads to a stronger pluralistic orientation for all whites. And lastly, cross-racial interaction in college promotes an integrated post-college lifestyle for whites from segregated neighborhoods. And so what are the implications for higher education? Higher education can play a role in preparing students for life in an increasingly diverse society and workplace. And secondly, higher education can play a role in breaking the cycle of segregation in our society. And that's it for now, and I'm happy to take questions after the panelists speak.
Okay, thank you very much, Uma. We'd like to invite the two panelists up to the front, please, and I'll just make some commentary about them, and they'll give both some more focused commentary, and we'll open it up for broader Q&A and question and answer. But Patricia Guerin is the Nancy Cantor Distinguished University Professor Emeritus of Psychology, and she's also a Women's Studies Arthur E. Truman Professor. She was not only the lead author on the article that inspired the work of Uma Jayakumar, but she also presented those findings in an expert witness in the University of Michigan's Defense of Affirmative Action case that that Uma just talked about. She has published extensively on inequality and identity and their implications for the social psychology of political action and mental health. She is currently the PI on a 10-university longitudinal research evaluation of intergroup dialogue funded by the W.T. Grant Foundation and the Ford Foundation. Following Patricia Guerin, we'll have the second Pat, Patricia King, who is a professor in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education here at the University of Michigan in the School of Education. Her teaching and research focus on learning and development among late adolescents and adults, including college students. She has written 2 books and published more than 50 articles and is currently principal investigator of the University of Michigan team of the National Study on Liberal Arts Education, sponsored by the Center of Inquiry in Liberal Arts at Wabash College. And one of the things I think that we want to kind of raise in this discussion, among others that the two panelists may want to mention, is the implications, is not only the content of these findings, both the original ones in the 2002 Harvard Ed article and this sequel in the 2008 Harvard Ed Review, is the implications, among other things. In some ways, we've discussed initially the student development implications, of which Pat King, I'm sure, has some comments and thoughts on. That is, to what degree does a diverse experience, both numerical and in terms of intense interaction, facilitate the growth and development of students while in campus. The second issue is the organizational implications. What is it about a diverse campus environment at the organizational level? How do you produce such a organizational context, and how is that managed, and what effects and impact at the organizational level that may have both on students and other participants in the campus community? The third kind of foci that we like to kind of consider is the global implications. I think one of the things that Uma's presentation, even the framing of it, suggests is that for white students and for students of color, the ability to engage others in a productive way has had major and significant measurable impacts on their leadership skills and their ability to engage leadership roles, of which in a global society, in an increasingly global society, becomes kind of profoundly important as a compelling interest for universities and also a compelling interest for other institutions in society, including the military, corporate interests, and others. And that this global implication is one that I don't think we talk as much about, but we'd also like to consider along with the student development and the organizational one. So we'll first of all, it doesn't really matter. We'll go and start with Patricia Gurin and make as many comments as you think fit. And if you don't mind people asking questions while you present, then you can frame it the way you wish, and then we'll move to Pat and open it up for broader question and answer. Give the two panelists a hand.
Well, first of all, if you haven't read the article, it's a tour de force. It's full of direct and indirect effects. And Uma does a marvelous job of presenting all this in a way that sort of organizes the results that you can understand them. So she has a section that tries to help you understand what's happening with structural diversity, what's happening with cross-racial interaction, what's happening with campus racial climate. So you don't end up this article with just this long series of all these effects that you have to make sense of. Uma does a great job making sense of these effects herself and presenting them in a way that you have a takeaway, a big picture from this article. The second thing I want to comment on is she is doing a wonderful job of bringing back to life structural diversity. In the court case, the opposition tried to argue that really you don't need to have diverse peers on a campus for diversity to work. People could just read about it. So content, what you read, is as important as having structural diversity. I mean, they really imagined that somehow diversity of real people is not important as long as there's some kind of things that you read in classes. They would never argue that with respect to international student abroad exchange approaches, where indeed those very same people would argue that you need to have the experience of being abroad, not just reading about France, but being in France. So it's wonderful that Uma has brought back to life what structural diversity does. It doesn't have many direct effects, as you could see. So it's operating through other things. It's setting up conditions that make other aspects of the college experience have effects on students. But that's terribly important, and so her findings on how structural diversity sets up a racial climate, which is, I want to come back to that measure in a minute, which sets up racial climate that then has an effect on cross-racial interaction, even though there isn't more cross-racial interaction in the most diverse institutions if you don't take account of what the racial climate is all about. So that's a terrific contribution. Third contribution is that measure of racial climate. So aggregating across all individual students in 220-some institutions, each institution aggregating across to find out how much cross-racial interaction on average happens at this institution, and then at that institution, and then at another institution. The first time there's been a behavioral measure of racial climate. John Matlock and Katrina Wade and Jerry Gurn and I, some time back, wrote a little piece for something, Diversity Digest or something, on how to think about those typical measures of racial climate, which usually are measures where you say, please, would you tell me how much friendship is there across races on your campus? Please, would you tell me how well do people get along on your campus? Now, those are lousy measures, because what they do is turn the student into a reporter of what the student thinks happens out there, which we showed in that little article, had no relevance whatsoever to what was happening in their own lives. In their own lives, they had quite a bit of cross-racial interaction, but they reported that it never happens here. So UMA's using an aggregation, an average of what their actual behaviors are, is a much, much richer way of thinking about racial climate. That's just terrific. I love the fact that she expresses the political controversies very thoughtfully. She does a very nice, fair, balanced approach to what the opposition has continued to say about diversity. Not only what they said during the Supreme Court case, but what they're saying now. She didn't mention it today, but she does an analysis where she looks at one of the claims of the other side is you don't really need to be in a diverse institution. You can just go to a liberal arts institution. And a liberal arts institution is just as effective as a diverse institution in promoting all kinds of positives like pluralistic orientation. And she actually takes that claim, as most recently published by Umrah and Koo, and shows that indeed it's simply not the case, that it's really the diversity of the institution that matters. So that little piece, that little nugget in this article is provocative and terribly important. She also does a test of what she's calling the Gurns theory, which we didn't test at all. So we argued really much more broadly than in a specific way that UMA has tested. At the time that the Supreme Court data were being analyzed, based both on SERP and on Michigan student study data, at Michigan, 98% of our white students were coming from segregated environments, both neighborhoods and high schools. 50% of the African American students were. So we were making a general argument that for most students coming to Michigan, its level of diversity, which was something like 23 to 28% students of color, was discontinuous with their backgrounds. For white students, almost all of them, it was discontinuous for. So we used that discontinuity argument with developmental psychology as a framework for why diversity should matter in higher education. But indeed, we never tested if the effects of would be different for students who'd been in segregated versus integrated neighborhoods. So that's lovely that UMA has done that. And with a large sample like comes from SERP, it's possible to get 1,000 students out of her 7,000 plus who had actually attended and lived in diverse neighborhoods during high school. So that certainly is a very positive contribution. Is this going to make any difference? Is UMA's piece going to make any difference to this controversy? Not one whit. Why not? Because the other side is absolutely going to keep this battle going, because the more that is written, the more that is said about questioning the value of diversity, the more there are reasons for higher education institutions, not only from the threat of affirmative action lawsuits, but because they're being attacked all the time about diversity, to not really do very much about assuring that we have diversity. The best experience I can tell you about is maybe 2 years ago. Kirk Lansky, who's a political scientist, I believe, at Illinois. Is he a political scientist? Yeah.
James.
Yeah, is he a political scientist? Anyway, he published this piece in Public Opinion Quarterly, where he took essentially what we did in the Harvard Educational Review article, and an article that was published by one of the major opponents of affirmative action during the Supreme Court case. And he had critiques to make of what we did. But we came out so much better than the opposition. And I don't even think anybody ever cites that article of his. That was a very careful, systematic, methodological analysis of two approaches, where one side, it was completely cross-sectional. There were many things that were wrong with the other published piece. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't go on trying to do this research, and I'm delighted Uma did. I just hope, as young as Uma is, that Uma doesn't imagine that she's solved a controversy that will now go away. She has done a marvelous job of adding additional data for an ongoing series of controversies that don't have too much to do with research results and a great deal to do with political ideology.
I, too, would like to thank Dr. Jayakumar for a wonderful piece. It was really a delight to read. And I say that having read a lot of thick, rich, descriptive kind of articles, but the clarity is quite impressive, as well as the significance of the questions asked. I thought you were going to say that, given her point in her career, we might be able to, that you would be disappointed if she was still raising these kinds of questions, in another 40 years. And I hope that the start we've had today will get us away from that, or at least that it'll be a different kind of argument, that we will have learned something from this and made big strides in terms of diversity education. I would also like to specifically thank Dr. Gurin for years and years and years of hard work on this topic. I mean, this is remarkable to come to this point in time, and look at the contribution that she and the other researchers on the team have made that enabled this level to go on. So thank you directly for that from the field and the university as well. I want to say just a little bit about the position from which my own remarks come today. First, I am a dyed-in-the-wool interactionist by training. Way back to the work of John Mark Baldwin, to Lewin's work, to Dewey's work, that to me the study of environments alone is insufficient, and so is the study of persons alone, that persons are in context, and the need to look at the relations between person and environment is a very strong root of my own training, and it's one actually that's so firm I sometimes forget to say it. I assume that it's there, and that of course everyone agrees with that. Of course, much of the research that looks only at environments or only at persons flies in the face of that. So I've actually tried to be more explicit about attending that in my own work as well, and I think this is one place where I want to try to link student characteristics with environmental characteristics as a way of understanding diverse actions. Second, I find student development to be one of the most fascinating topics around. Indeed, have devoted a good deal of my professional career to that, and it is a field that is changing so fast that it's hard to keep up with it. So the theoretical richness that's now available is truly remarkable. And I want to bring that back to bear on these comments. Third, I have tried to integrate work across models of student development in a model of what we're calling intercultural maturity that looks at progressive development over time in mature capacities that enable the kind of diverse interactions or interactions with diverse others that we've talked about here, but that uses a holistic framework so that it asks questions about what are the cognitive capacities around cognitive complexity, how does your intrapersonal development or your sense of self affect your willingness to engage with others, affect the degree to which you are threatened by others who are different from yourself. And then the third dimension, the social relational dimension, and the way in which your assumptions about your interactions with others affects your ability to be interculturally mature, or in this particular context, to have effective interactions across difference. Last, I also did a fascinating study of critical consciousness, although I've only published one article from that. We looked at the experiences of multicultural educators, people who have specifically chosen to work in this field around diversity issues, and what has their professional life been, and how did they come to critical consciousness about their own role, about race in society, about what educational systems should be that should do from that. So I draw from all four of those threads. The student development piece that I want to add to this discussion, I see as what a follow-up study to this one might be. I love that it's longitudinal, and of course that makes it that much more difficult to replicate. So in another 15 years, let's have this conversation around that. The piece that we'll add here is, how do students understand their diversity experiences? It's connected with, what do they see a pluralistic orientation really means to them? So taking your comment about the failure of higher education to train graduates for a global economy, for the workforce, et cetera, it seems to me is also a failure of higher education to I don't know if these are trainable. That sounds a little too environmental to me. I'm trying to get interactive language here. But the failure of students to learn the capacities that it takes to bring a mature understanding to their diverse interactions. So as we talk about the role of exposure to diverse others, that seems to me absolutely critical, and a position from which we should not waver, because the experiential is so much more powerful than the didactic and even the vicarious. So the one-on-one interactions are terribly important, because from a developmental perspective, if it happened to you, it's much harder to discount than if it happened to somebody else. So taking that little piece into account seems to me that it's important. It's important to ask the next question is, what beyond exposure? Like exposure, then what? If exposure is necessary but not sufficient for the development of the pluralistic orientation. And that's where I see linking this kind of work on the nature of college environments with a student development work on development within the individual, and really linking them theoretically, conceptually, methodologically, analytically, could be very powerful. So if you take the construct of a pluralistic orientation, that is a very rich idea, the ability to see something from someone else's point of view and to really walk in their shoes, as a phrase has also been used, which I think is wonderful, that you mirror that walking in their shoes as you report the arguments of the opponents. So that she's doing the kind of perspective taking, saying what's the rationale for the statement. And once you understand it, then you can, of course, break it down and analyze it much more effectively. So if you look at this notion of a pluralistic orientation, that seems to me not a sufficient end point. It's a starting point in some ways for some students. Now, I think it's a very important collegiate outcome. It's grounded in a lot of research on cognitive development and identity development, as Uma noted. And this is where I think the theorizing that has happened since Perry's seminal work, since Erickson's work, since Kohlberg's work, really can come to bear in looking at more nuanced and contemporary views around what is this construct. I'll stay with the pluralistic orientation. Other theorists have different levels for it, but much of the center of that construct has its roots in those older theories. So, for example, if you look at this perspective taking as a broad measure measures one aspect of the contribution of the many theories that are now available in cognitive development. It measures one aspect of the contributions around identity development. So, for example, if you are reluctant, or if a student is reluctant to have interaction with diverse peers because that's somehow threatening to one's own sense of identity, then that shows how identity affects interactions. If you are reluctant to engage in a controversial conversation because the individual might disagree and therefore might not like you, or would be one of those spaces it's not safe to really explore, sometimes that gets conceived of as political correctness. Other times it's a real awkwardness or even a fear about that conversation because it's so unfamiliar. So in many ways, your sense of self, or your sense of self as a person with a racial identity you want to bring to a conversation, a question mark for a lot of white folks around, what, me, racial identity? Been fairly well documented. But when you define yourself as a white person going into a conversation, it's a different kind of conversation than if you take for granted a position of power or a position of privilege that comes with not taking a racial identity into account because you're oblivious about it. So, lots of good solid work on identity development, I think, could inform how students interact with diverse others, and at the same time thinking of some of the work around intersectionality of racial identities, of identity salience, and the kinds of ways that multiple identities come to bear in a definition of identity. But to put it in an environmental context, the choices that people often report making of which identity to make salient in a given context for a given purpose. So that a student may be reluctant to engage in these diverse interactions in one context and quite willing to do so in another context. I think the intergroup dialogue programs are a fabulous way to do that because they are sustained over time, because there's a reflection component, because there's a balance in the power dynamic. There are many things at place in that well-conceived program that enable a very different kind of interracial interaction than exists in a lot of other kinds of programs. In my own work in the Wabash Liberal Arts Project, and I just need to do my 5-second advertisement about that. Liberal arts, it's not about liberal arts colleges, it's about liberal arts outcomes. And so we have a range of institutions, from community college to research ones within this. We also have Hispanic serving institutions, and a real outlier as the stereotype of liberal arts colleges, a small private liberal arts college that's half African American and half white. So, granted, from this particular study, one of the outcomes we're looking at is intercultural effectiveness. And one of the topics that students have reported in their annual interviews with us has often touched upon interactions with diverse others. So I want to pause on this point and point out a couple of findings from a study, and my co-authors in the room, Johanna Massey at the back, along with Marcia Baxter-Magolda. We presented this at the AAC&U meeting in the fall. We particularly pulled out examples from interviews where students said they had uncomfortable interactions across diversity. So it wasn't overall diverse interactions, but this was a theme in our analyses, these uncomfortable ones. And we explored the themes, breaking it down by race, and that was quite informative. For the white students, the discomfort was based on an aspect of the other's social identity. I'd never talked to the gay person before. Here I was sitting next to an African American person. There was something about who they were that made me uncomfortable. For many of these students, they were immobilized by the discomfort. And so what did they do? I mean, here we have the kind of interaction that we're intentionally trying to design. Not the discomfort part, but the interaction part. But that discomfort trumped the possibilities. And so their reactions were characterized in many cases by a flight response. You know, I left the situation. I decided I was never going to walk in that class again. I wasn't going to go in that part of the cafeteria again. I was just going to stay away. There was also, among these students, little evidence of preparation for or inclination to more deeply look at the nature of the interaction. And they would, some would tell us, this is the first time I've told anybody this happened to me. So here we have potentially a teachable moment, and the discomfort experienced by these white students really led to this flight response. So I think that's going to trump our ability to engage or to help students develop pluralistic orientations if they're fleeing from a first encounter. For the students of color, it was quite different. How they emphasized how social organizations are affected by racial dynamics. So right at the start of this conversation about how they understood the discomfort is that they could take a more cognitively complex view, take it out of a one-on-one individual situation and put it in an organizational context. They also reported a deepening awareness through these interactions that they found uncomfortable, a deepening awareness about the role of race in the U.S. and questioning their own roles and responsibilities for dealing with that. So I mentioned those findings, although they're based on again, just this one little subset of the themes, because I think they're indicative of the complexity underlying students' meaning-making about diverse interactions and what the kinds of things going on in those that I think we'll need to attend to, because they mediate the likelihood of achieving those higher order outcomes we have. I think we neglect the student development piece of that at our peril.
Okay, let's give the two panelists a hand. Okay, we'd like to now open it up for broader discussion. I made a comment earlier that, of course, we like and welcome and invite commentary from my colleagues in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education, who co-sponsors of this event. I also noticed that John Madlock just came in, and Patricia Gurin mentioned the collaborative work that she and others have been involved with John and OWAMI, which also were very, very important in the Supreme Court case in 2003. One of the things I'd like to kind of mention as we move to the Q&A, is that I think Pat King in some ways focused specifically on the student development implications of both this broader issue as well as the kind of findings that Uma has shared today. And I think Patricia Gurin emphasized both organizational implications, especially the aggregate measure of campus climate. Really does hark to the very, very important organizational implications, I think, of Uma's work. And thirdly, I think Pat Gurin also, in her mention of structural diversity and the rather complex and the ideological issues undergirding the proponents and opposition to affirmative action raised really profound public policy questions and public policy implications of Uma's findings. And I think, as I said at the onset, that the global issues that are certainly salient in Uma's framing, combined with these student development and organizational and public policy questions, and that I think both panelists did a fantastic job of giving some depth and some resonance to the student development, organizational, and public policy implications. So with that, we'll open it up for for anybody who has, and I think Valerie has a roving mic. Anyone who may have a question, a comment, or any other contribution to the exchange and discourse.
I just had to ask a question since no one else wanted to do this. I have a two-part question. One is most of the conversation has been about interaction between students. But it seems to me there's several levels of interaction. And I'd like to hear something about, for example, we talk about cross-racial interaction, but what would your take be on same race, same group interaction? Because when we talk, for example, African American, 50% coming from the urban area, that means it's wide open for interaction with African American students from suburban communities, from other states, and that seems to be extremely important. The reason I asked the question is because at sometimes we send the message that cross-racial interactions are great, but when a group of African American students get together, it's problematic perception. It's something wrong. So when we talk about self-segregation, the self-segregation finger is always pointed at African American students in many cases, and not at, for example, the mega self-segregated fraternities and sororities, which we say is a great thing. The second part would be another level of interaction that seems to be very important would be the interaction with faculty and students of color. And so what you hear, oftentimes students say, well, I can hold my own against other students, but I do have a problem about issues of respect, appreciation, mentoring by faculty. So I'd like to hear you address your perception maybe on those two issues.
Okay, we'll invite Uma back up and give her a shot at it, and then maybe one of the panelists may want to make a comment, and then we open it up and then go to the next question.
Well, I completely agree with you about even the term balkanization, and the reason I use that term is to kind of bring in that conservative argument. I'm a strong believer in counter spaces, and so it's basically the same term for the same thing that one group calls self-segregation and another group calls counter spaces. I think it's extremely important, especially for people of color, to be able to have those counter spaces in order to be able to operate on a larger, less welcoming campus. And actually, when I originally proposed my dissertation, I had a portion of it, several other analyses on different groups, and one of them was on Black students. And I wanted to look at the benefits for them of interacting in same group peer with peers, and as well as cross-racial interaction, and how I believe that one facilitates the other versus being of detriment. So I'm not sure if that answers that first question, but I do believe, even from other research that I've done, qualitative research, that it's critical for students in terms of getting a sense of cultural integrity to be able to interact with peers of their own race. And then in terms of faculty involvement, that's also very important, especially for students of color, and to be in environments where they're able to interact with other faculty of color. And that would, if I had the ability to do a broader assessment of the campus climate, that would definitely be something that I would like to include in that assessment, is how often do these students have access to faculty of color to be able to interact with them and have positive experiences, and to see people that are in these positions that look like them. So I do agree that these other components are very important. And like I said, I do both qualitative and quantitative research, and one of the things that really inspired me about Pat Guerin's the expert testimony is because a lot of times I get frustrated with quantitative data sets because it's so limited in terms of how you could look at it. Even my measure of cross-racial interaction is very it doesn't really tell you anything about the quality of that interaction. But the way I see it and the way I saw it play out in the Supreme Court cases is that in terms of building evidence for something that is so important. So I think it is important to think about the missing pieces and how that can be added to, and I think that there's more potential to add to those type of questions through qualitative research that really do justice to what's really happening for these students. So.
Any of the panelists, any comment?
Hi, thank you very much for the summary of the paper, and looking forward to reading it. Thanks to the panelists, of course, as well. I've got two questions that attach to the research. They're not really about the research, but I'll say the second one first, because maybe you want to come back to that. But so the second one is about social justice. It sounded to me, when you set the frame for your research and your motivation for doing this work, that you knew you weren't going to be able to engage with participation in social justice in terms of what the students were doing or directly issues. But it seemed that you had I thought I saw that you had some ideas about how to approach that. So I'd be interested to hear whether you think that your research is going to be going in that direction. And I think Pat King's comments also, most of us here, I can presume, have some interest in that direction. So I'd be interested to know how you're seeing tracking in that direction. The other question, just briefly, and I also have to apologize for having to leave early because I have another diversity event. Is about the big picture of the structure of the institutions of higher learning in relationship to this. You framed this discussion and the purpose of the research in relationship to the need to prepare students for a workforce and for a social future. But it does strike me that historically institutions of higher education often are lagging behind social transformations that have taken place other ways, aren't necessarily leading in that direction. And that when you think about future impacts, that it may be, I don't know if the horse and cart analogy, I'm not sure it works with this, but in any event, whether I would be interested in your views on the future of higher education in relationship to responding to pressures that come from the constituents, or perhaps from the idea that students may choose for themselves and desire to learn in more diverse settings because they are increasingly seeing that as a future for them. So that's that question.
Okay, so I want to make sure I answer all your questions. So the first question, can you rephrase the first question? I got lost in the second one.
Do you see your research in the framework of it as heading towards social justice?
Okay, that's a really good question. I think the way I would answer that is, if you look at my dissertation itself, I spend a lot of time talking about the diversity argument and analyzing it and seeing how it's kind of progressed in a way that it is incorporating more social justice language. And I think there's a potential for it to continue to go in that direction. And I try to do that to the extent that I can. I also feel that the diversity argument, I have very mixed feelings about it. Because I do feel that it's very limited when we do take out the social justice agenda in making that argument, even though it is, it's the argument that the courts can hear. But in some ways it takes us away from actually addressing social justice issues. And people have made that, Derek Bell talks about that in terms of affirmative action. Affirmative action is actually taking us away from addressing the real issues, such as the differences in financial aid that are actually creating more inequalities for Black and Latino students, like the school systems and how the inequalities in our K through 12 system are creating much more disparities than what we're fixing with affirmative action. So I definitely see affirmative action and the diversity argument as a Band-Aid solution. And I think at this point in my life, I have to put the Band-Aids on because I'm so frustrated by what's happening. But at the same time, I do see the direction of my research also going in places where I do look more at the social justice imperative. And looking at how racism is a huge problem and talking about it in ways that I think are more important. So, yeah, and in terms of the second question, can you repeat?
Yeah, it was just about the direction of, it relates to social justice because it has to do with access to higher education.
Yeah.
And the notion that historically institutions may have responded to social pressures externally rather than leading the way, as your framework for your paper seems to suggest, leading the way to create opening doors, to be transformative in providing opportunities and preparation for students for a diverse future.
Well, I believe that there is a potential for institutions to be more I know that institutions have made efforts in terms of their rhetoric, and also actually the University of Michigan engaging in the court cases shows a tremendous effort. But as far as increasing the number of students of color on campus, that hasn't happened to as much of a degree as I guess I would have liked to see. And but I see other initiatives, for example, in terms of sports programs and athletics, where they're miraculously able to do this. And so I absolutely believe that when the pressures become even more, where businesses start to say, we're not going to hire from people from coming out of your college because your institutions are much too homogenous, I think that that's going to somehow make an incredible difference, and we're going to see all kinds of changes, and it's all of a sudden going to be possible. So, yeah. Do you guys have anything to add? Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions?
I have a really simple question, actually.
When we answer, you may share with us who you are, if you don't mind, and then ask the question.
Sure. I'm Nancy Burke. I'm a doctoral student at the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education. What do you think institutions can do to build upon these indirect benefits of structural diversity? What would you recommend?
Well, I don't think that this research in particular speaks to what institutions could actually do. I think there's a lot of other research that does talk about institutional programming, but I think that it is important for it to be intentional. And one of the things that the study does indicate is that it's important for students of color and white students, but in particular students of color, to be able to feel comfortable on those college campuses. And when there is a warm and welcoming environment, and I think that takes a lot on the part of the institution to create such an environment that students are more likely to interact across race and to benefit from the experiences that those colleges can then intentionally provide. So I guess in terms of what the study implies is it's in terms of creating a warmer, more inclusive college campus climate for all students.
I would like to add something to that. There are some very simple things that we don't do. So, for example, in Uma's work, once again, there's a clear negative effect of being in fraternities and sororities. She didn't mention it today, but it's there. Does that mean we shouldn't have fraternities and sororities? We're never going to get rid of fraternities and sororities. But many faculty have been trying for many years to have rush, not in the fall, 3 weeks after they arrive here. They get into our residence halls. There's a lot of effort now in our residence halls to create a welcoming environment for all students, to build communities within the residence halls. And 3 weeks later, the students are splitting. And then another community becomes incredibly important to them. So there's been an effort to try to get rush postponed until the second semester. And as far as I know, we cannot get our regents to back that kind of proposal. So it's simple, but terribly hard to enact. So would that change a huge amount? It would change a considerable amount. The first year is the only year at Michigan when students are living in really diverse environments, because by the second year, many of them are either living in fraternities and sororities or they're living in apartments. So we miss an opportunity to maximize what residence hall living could be by the fact that we can't do anything about postponing. Many of our peer institutions don't have rush until the sophomore year.
That's a good point.
It's tiny but big.
Any other question? Ed St. John and I teach a seminar on myriad diversity in higher education, and there are several students in the room who are in that course. So if no one else has a question, you get brownie points.
Hi, my name is Roxanne. I'm from the Social Work and Anthropology doctoral program. I'm sort of a returned student. I came here in '93, was took off to organize the Latino community in this county, immigrants actually, and decided to come back to finish my PhD, and these are my two kids right here. And first of all, I'd like to thank I think your research is fascinating. I wish I'd been able to read the article before because I'd have many more comments and questions. But essentially, my work has been about trying to integrate the university as an institution with primary, middle school, and high school education. Because I think that historically we've created an artificial gap and have not tended to our responsibilities, and then we face the problems that we're facing now. And there are many institutions that have preceded the University of Michigan in efforts to try to create that tie, or acknowledge it, let's say. And one of them is the University of California, Berkeley, that I was really amazed at the kind of program they've been able to create for over 25 years. And it's one of the institutions I'd like to include in my research. But as you've all been discussing these issues, I was sort of thinking about, I'm sorry, I don't know, sir, could you repeat your name? I'm sorry? John and Kriska's comments, and I thought they were very interesting. One of the things that we did with the community organization that we founded was bring it to the University of Michigan Multicultural Center. The idea was for the children to realize that the university was not an ivory tower, but it was an everyday experience that was possible for them. And we joined in with University of Michigan students of color and not of color, white people, so that they could see that there was something, a mutual learning experience that they could engage in. And there were all sorts of interesting dynamics going on there. But one of the things that I thought is fabulous about the Multicultural Center here that's different from other institutions, and this is based on a conversation that I had with the director, is that although there are many centers that call themselves multicultural, they often cater to one ethnic community. And what's been done at U of M is that it's truly been a multicultural center. It's a huge effort to bring different ethnicities together and to contribute to each other. Now, when we talk about comfort in welcoming students of color and cultural competence, I think that we need to acknowledge, and I guess you may have mentioned this in your article, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to read it yet, cultural competence is not only about feeling comfortable, it's actually about feeling very uncomfortable and coming to terms with the history of discrimination that many populations have undergone. And as an anthropology student, I don't know if many of you know, the anthropology department can be quite conflictual. And when you bring all these different ethnicities together, oftentimes you have sparks. I recall as a graduate student many years ago when the minority were white students in the graduate seminar traditions. The majority were students of color, and they had very specific things to say about how they felt the class should be run. And the white students felt like the outcasts. In fact, they were silenced. They did not dare speak. And I'm not sure if they ever came to terms with each other's issues, but the faculty had to get together with the class to try to create a dialogue. I don't know how successful it was, but to start this out. And that's part of being culturally competent and facing that. And the white student's argument was, I'm not responsible for what my ancestors did. There's just so much I can do. This is why I'm here. So it's just to take into that consideration, that aspect, sort of the structural aspects, I think, that Kriska was mentioning, and also the fact that you were mentioning, and John was also mentioning, that you need both. It's not only a community of interaction with different ethnicities, but you also need a community of support of the ethnicity that the student belongs to, and that's something that the Multicultural Center has helped to foster, but many other institutions in the university are not ready to do that as yet. The other issue that I don't know if you mentioned in your paper is, and again, sort of following up on Kriska's comment, is the university's responsibility and sort of critical analysis of what exactly is it doing, what is its position within the liberal economy and international global economy that we're living in, when we're providing services for underprivileged children, become youth, to have access and be productive in a college institution. I'm not sure if you're aware of Akhil Gupta's work, where he did a fascinating analysis of outsourcing in India. And what he found out was that the Indian government was promoting free education for the lower castes in order to create these outsourcing labor force, low-paid, highly educated individuals so that they could cater to the international businesses and therefore be productive for the elites in India. So I think that when we take on projects like the ones that we're thinking about really reinforcing, we need to think about our position globally as well, and sort of structurally the effect that we're having and that we wish to have not only on the students but on the international economy, our position in that.
Okay, Uma, any comment? I also noticed in terms of some of the dialogue issues, we have Mark Chesler in the room, who, along with Pat Guerin and others, have been involved with a whole range of, for historically, some of the difficulty and tension and both productive consequences of conflict and tension and dialogue. Also, I know Ed St. John is also interested in this kind of issue. I just mentioned the names because I know those individuals have a wealth of experience to add in addition to anything Uma may have to say.
Just really quickly in terms of your comment, I think I agree, and I think that takes us back to the point of why just increasing structural diversity on campus isn't enough. That there is a lot of other issues that colleges have to take responsibility if they're dealing with in order to achieve educational benefits for all students. So I think I'll just leave it at that.
I think it'd be great if Mark said something about if Mark said something about the question that was raised about faculty, because Mark has been on the role of faculty, especially faculty who are white faculty who are committed to, I don't know,
That wasn't me that time, Mark. That was Patricia.
It's not about Uma's paper per se.
Right, but just a broader challenge.
Just the broader challenge of what to do about faculty, especially white faculty.
Well, in an institution, characteristic of other institutions that don't place a high priority on undergraduate education anyway, to imagine how that institution could pay attention to these issues of race, ethnic, gender diversity in undergraduate education is really pushes the envelope quite a bit. What we've been trying to, Al Young and I have been trying to explore with a team of undergraduate and graduate students is how faculty members of different racial ethnic backgrounds and in different disciplines and of different genders approach the issue of socially and racially just classrooms. So it's not just how they teach in diverse classrooms, but how they deal with issues of race and gender, whether the classroom is diverse or not diverse. And by and large, we know that some faculty members have figured out how to at least challenge, I wouldn't say overcome, but at least how to challenge the prevailing white hegemony that gets passed down through our education, through our university system. And others haven't figured out that that's an issue. Or if they figured out it's an issue, haven't figured out how to pay productive attention to it. And as a result, they're engaged in reproducing the original racial and gender hierarchy. I guess that's my contribution to this conversation. It just says there is, as I guess John raised the question about faculty. That does take the question of campus racial climate to a different level. It suggests that we might measure campus racial climate by more than student activity or perceptions, but also by where faculty is and what the institution's policies and procedures are. And then it also raises the question of how we begin to deal with the dominant players in this venture, namely the faculty, as opposed to, I don't want to say the victims, but the non-dominant players.
Yeah, in case people didn't know, and I think there was a very astute organizational comments about the whole construct of campus climate. You know, Pat certainly talked about the benefits of aggregation and looking at that not as a through the individual lens of students, but understanding it as an organizational phenomenon. But I think, to me, the emphasis on faculty and their authority and power in the broader context of universities as organizations and some of the kind of policy issues attendant to those are very astute comments. And for people who don't know, Mark Chesler is emeritus professor here and been engaged in the organizational work at the University of Michigan since I was here in the early 70s. He was doing it then. And so he certainly has a lot of not only experience, but also his work as a sociologist has focused on these issues.
I think there's also the question of the dominant role of the faculty. Most work on this campus is being done creatively with students on these issues, both from a social justice perspective and from a more just the value of diversity perspective, is being done by people in student affairs. That's true of the residence education program and the residence halls. Intergroup dialogue is co-sponsored by both academic and student affairs. The Student Activities and Leadership Office is doing a huge amount. The Ginsberg Center, which is involving students in the community, often interacting across all these divides. And yet, the faculty have an enormous voice. And I don't think we faculty are the ones who are most ready to do what Mark is suggesting of figuring out how to challenge the hegemony both of whites and privileged people, but also of the faculty. Mm-hmm. So it's like this divide between student and academic affairs is really, I think, an extraordinarily serious issue, not just on this campus, but on all others.
This is part of the structure of this kind of, it's embedded into the institutions. I know I've had some discussions with John Madlock also, who's, for those of you who may not know, made one of the earlier comments, but also has been involved as an administrator here at the University of Michigan for quite a while, and also has written about some of these organizational diversity questions. And I've heard from John, and I'm particularly kind of pointing to people who I know have a lot of kind of grounded both research and professional experience in these issues. But I know John has long emphasized the importance of campus climate, and also emphasized it as something that was more than just what student discourse on it. You know, not that they're not, as Mark said, affected predominantly by these issues, but they certainly don't construct it. They don't construct, you know, the experience themselves in a political sense, you know. So I, you know, I thought I would also just, you know, encourage John Madlock, if he has any comments, to make them about the kind of issues that Mark raised about campus climate and what it would take to actually deal with that as an organizational construct.
Well, before he does it, I want to make clear, John's own outfit does a huge amount. It isn't that there aren't programs and centers in academic affairs that do just as rich work as student affairs. I'm talking about the faculty role in academic affairs, which is quite different from GIU and OAMI and all the other wonderful programs that are on the academic side. So mine was a critique of faculty.
Just a brief comment. It would seem to me that part of the problem, as we discuss all this, that and it was we alluded to it earlier, that institutions are resistant to change. And so the message oftentimes that we send to students of color is the quicker, okay, you're here, the quicker you figure out our values, our culture, and how you fit in, the better off you will be. And so what it suggests is that the burden of change relative to diversity is on the students. And the institution sends the message, and this is, you can insert any school where Michigan is. The message is that we have no responsibility to change at all. The change is on you. And so it's almost like having an assimilation model. And I jokingly say that, is that we're not changing anything. We've been around for 200 years. And so just figure out how to fit in and figure out how to get along with everybody else. And so that message, I think, is a very devastating institutional message to students who come to the institution from very segregated communities, trying to figure out how this is supposed to work, but also trying to reinforce their own racial identity. I think students explore both. They reinforce whatever identity that they believe in, which can change, and at the same time, they're trying to have interactions with other student groups and other individual students. And it doesn't take much for things to blow up in your face, including the classroom. I mean, if you don't know what you're doing relative to diversity, it can blow up in your face real quick. And I think that sometimes faculty become very reluctant to even talk about it because everyone's worried about things blowing up in the classroom on a mistake, a misspoken word, the possibility or the perception that you're taking sides, which students of color are very sensitive about. I mean, if there is a discussion in the classroom, if you don't manage that discussion, if you give the perception of taking sides, it will create problems.
Just to follow, how much do you think we need to, or how to focus on the organization level of analysis and responsibility in this, and also policy? Because kind of implicit in your comment is that in this assimilation model is that there's not enough attention on what the university could do as an organization, and furthermore, how policy and leadership, also play into these kind of issues. Just in general, again, this goes beyond the University of Michigan case, but just a question about how to make progress on these issues in ways that goes beyond the narrow focus on student responsibility.
I yield my time to here.
I want to just highlight a few things. One is not only did Uma do a great paper, but she expressed an optimism about the role of research and the possibility of change. I think that in fact, Phil and I were talking about this earlier today, how discouraging it can be if you continue to engage in the battle and you don't see the extent of change you'd like to see. As a relative newcomer to this place, though, I do want to say that at least the perception of mission change here, attributable to the standing up at the court in the legal process, is something that's attracting, I think, a generation of people here who are committed to a couple of goals. I mean, one is to create an experiment with creating learning environments that do move toward a more just kind of way of learning. And so I think that there is a next generation of us engaged. I think that the policy issue, the social justice questions that Uma was speaking to relate also to the affirmative action problem, because she used the word Band-Aid, and the fact is that it was never a solution to the dramatic inequalities that we have. And so I also applaud our institution with respect to student aid and other things it's trying to do to keep the doors open. And we couldn't do that if we didn't have the mission, in a sense, we have after the court case. But I think it's very important for us to kind of continue to fight the good fight and to engage in making change as we move ahead, even though it's not an easy battle.
I guess to comment a little bit in terms of the faculty issue, I mean, because this comes up in the medical school where is my home area, and the need for more diverse faculty. I think one of the things that I see from the university point of view is we have layer upon layer upon layer of acculturation, of we want to make sure you fit in. And, you know, when I try to, for example, to encourage the students of color to consider becoming faculty, they see these layers, you know, they see like, gee, you want me to be like you? You know, you want me to be like, you know, and that's a struggle because, you know, in a sense, to be a successful faculty, you talk about students, you know, the attitude we say, unless you fit in like us, you know, we're not going to change. You're supposed to adapt to us. I think that's magnified when you start going for a faculty position because you've got several layers of, you know, that. And similarly, the kinds of things in terms of faculty being, you know, involved in the classroom with these sort of things, you have to ask yourself, are these promotable events? You know, probably unless you make yours, you know, career along the lines of a Pat Gurn and things like that, most faculty would say, this is stuff I do in spite of, you know, my getting promoted. So yeah, I can raise a question in a classroom, run the risk of having all sorts of discord, and then my chair is going to say, but where's your paper, which doesn't relate to this, you know. And so that's something I think we have to struggle with as an institution. The thing that I keep coming back on, I think that would help us, which I don't know if Michigan will do this short of another institution actually competing out Michigan, and that is we have certain missions here in terms of saying we want to promote diversity, we want to you know, make this an inclusive environment. But I don't think we anchor many of these missions in a concrete enough fashion to really say, well, there are societal things that we aim to fix, you know, or we aim to make better, and we're not going to rest until we do that. So, for example, in the case of the medical school, you know, in our Office of Diversity, we try to promote awareness among various student groups about health issues of underserved, homeless, disadvantaged populations. But it's all elective, you know, and that's a rather minority, not only of students who are interested in it, but certainly even smaller in terms of faculty. And in a sense, the absence of really saying, hey, we've got this community that we've adopted, and we've got to now figure out why that health isn't better. It's the absence of that that then doesn't, it's not important for us necessarily to say, well, gee, maybe we ought to have some of our healthcare providers who come from that community. Or maybe, you know, gee, here are some language issues, here are some communication issues, here are some other thoughts about being comfortable with conflict. How do we teach people to become more comfortable with conflict so that we can engage and listen that way? We don't approach those things because it's not part of, in our case, getting ranked in U.S. News and World Report. You know, that's not one of the indices that they look at. So that's a tough one, but I think until almost you have another university of higher education that really takes that kind of role and says, we are training people to fix societal problems, and frankly, we're going to pull your bright students away from you because we will offer them that. I don't know that Michigan is going to change much. I would like to think so, but I don't know.
Okay, it's about 5 minutes to 6. We could probably have one more question.
My question really is, first of all, my name is Narita Gian, and I'm a graduate student at the School of Social Work. And I'm currently in a school social work intern at a high school in Southwest Detroit. And my question is, what can we do in a high school level to be able to help students who are in a segregated setting and integrate them into a diverse setting? So I'm asking this because I get a lot of faculty members that come to me and say, you're the school social worker. I have a lot of seniors that, you know, they've never been exposed to other people other than their race, and I want to know what workshop do we do so they are ready to move on to college and not freak out. So I'm wondering if there's any suggestions.
These are students in low access, low income neighborhoods, opposed to those students who are somewhat modest in their exposure from more affluent neighborhoods, which was really emphasized more in this dissertation. But you raised really that other question about homogeneous, low access communities of color, largely.
Well, I can speak on that from the perspective of one study that I did at a program called the Young Black Scholars Program. And so for these students, they were actually in, mostly Black students that were in campuses where they had a quote-unquote college-going culture. Well, that was what existed for the other students, but as far as their experience and in terms of really being able to interact with people of different races, I think it was, I guess what, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I guess I was going to say that being involved with groups where they're able to interact with people of different races and then also interact with people of their own race is very important. I think your question was that how do you deal with students in segregated environments that aren't able to interact with people of different races in college? And I don't think there's a simple answer to that question. I wish I had one for you.
I was thinking in terms of maybe workshops that you've heard, or something we can integrate into a curriculum for seniors in high school, something of that sort.
I haven't heard of any in particular. I don't know if anyone else can speak to the program.
Just very quickly, I mean, may not be able to help the actual school in terms of the time there, but one of the things this university does have, you have to figure it out, lots of summer-related programs for high school kids, many of which are in residence types of things. So, for example, the medical school runs something called Summer Science Academy, in which we go after 10th and 11th graders. And with the particular aim is not trying to get the high-end student necessarily who's going to make it in the academic anyway, but we try to hit those students that we feel we can help the best. And so we try to get from underserved, disadvantaged backgrounds, but we also have a mixture, and the purpose is to bring them here on this campus, in part to demystify Michigan. And some of the comments that the students have made over the years speak to this, on both sides. We have white kids saying, gee, this is the first time I've actually had an interaction with, kids of color, and vice versa, and a bit of demystifying kind of, gee, those folks aren't so bad after all, or gee, this university, even though it has a big building, then you've got some professors who actually will talk to you and, and make jokes and things like this. And so there are a whole host of things. And I know the School of Education at one point was trying to make a good catalog. I don't know where that stands.
Yeah, they have a version of it, but it's incomplete.
Yeah.
The outreach programs.
Mm-hmm.
Pardon? Yeah, I was going to mention in addition, that in fact, Pat just reminded me, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Barry Checkaway, who's a professor in the School of Social Works, a youth dialogue on race and ethnicity in metropolitan Detroit. Is specifically designed to bring together youth from isolated, if you will, relatively low-income inner-city neighborhoods with youth from equally isolated but more affluent suburban areas. And just that alone, I think does what you just said by definition. That it makes it provides a systematic opportunity for students in both isolated environments to really see the other world. And in addition to their exchanges across the 8 Mile or the urban-suburban divide in metropolitan Detroit, they also bring them to campus. Much like, as David Gordon said, it's one of an array of different opportunities to bring students into University of Michigan, which also demystifies the kind of campus environment. So again, Barry Checkaway's project is, I think, an exemplary model, along with the many pre-college outreach programs, including the ones who involve either summer or periodic, opportunities to visit campus. All right, it's about 2 minutes after 6, and I'd like to finally give Oma one round of applause. And I'd like to, note that in addition to her dissertation work, as I mentioned, she also spent a year at UCLA. And one reason I think she's so insightful and resourceful about these outreach programs, that she spent a year in Detroit as a postdoc working with Walter Allen and Sylvia Hurtado and others who were engaged in both research and support for the array of outreach programs and other kinds of activities in the University of California system. So let's give her a hand, and thank you very much for attending.